The heavy velvet curtains were drawn shut, hiding the stage from view, but the air inside the concert hall already felt thick with expectation. It was a Tuesday evening in late autumn, the kind of night where the wind rattles the window panes and people rush indoors seeking warmth and culture. The city was old, with cobblestone streets that echoed with history, and the grand concert hall was its crown jewel. The building had stood for over a century, its high ceiling adorned with intricate gold leaf designs that were starting to fade in spots, and its seats covered in plush red fabric that had been worn smooth by thousands of concert-goers over the decades. Tonight, the hall was nearly full. The audience was a mix of regular patrons, older couples dressed in their finest suits and evening gowns, university students with notebooks perched on their knees, and tourists who had stumbled upon the event hoping for a taste of local culture. There was a low hum of conversation, the sound of programs rustling, and the occasional cough that echoed loudly in the vast space. Everyone was waiting for the main event of the night, a master class and recital by a visiting pianist who is famous all over the world for his incredible skill and his somewhat cold, distant personality. Near the front, but slightly off to the left side, sat a young girl named Maya. She was 12 years old, small for her age, with dark hair that was pulled back into a loose braid and a simple blue dress that looked like it had been bought from a department store sale rack. In a sea of expensive perfumes and colognes, she smelled faintly of the soap her mother used at home. She was visibly different from the people around her, while the man next to her checked his gold watch and the woman in front adjusted her diamond necklace. Maya sat perfectly still. Her hands were clasped tightly together in her lap, knuckles white. Her eyes were fixed on the heavy red curtains separating her from the stage. Maya wasn't supposed to be here, not really. Her family didn't have a lot of money and tickets to the grand concert hall were usually something they only dreamed about. But her uncle, who worked as a cleaner for the venue, had managed to get her a last-minute seat when someone else canceled. It was a birthday surprise, one that had left her speechless for hours. To Maya, the piano wasn't just an instrument. It was magic. It was the way she spoke when she couldn't find the words, and the way she let out her feelings when the world felt too big and too loud. She had been playing on an old, slightly out-of-tune upright piano in her living room since she was 6 years old. Her fingers knew the keys better than they knew the faces of the kids at school. She looked around the hall, taking in the crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls from the ceiling and the thick columns that lined the walls. It felt intimidating. The grandeur of the place made her feel incredibly small, like a single speck of dust in a sunbeam. She shifted in her seat, her feet not quite touching the floor. She felt a pang of insecurity, wondering if the people around her could tell that she didn't belong. She wondered if they could smell the cheap detergent on her clothes or see the nervous excitement in her eyes. The lights in the hall began to dim slowly. The murmuring of the crowd died down instantly, replaced by a hushed silence that felt heavy and important. The velvet curtains started to part, moving smoothly along their track to reveal the stage. It was bathed in a single bright spotlight that illuminated the centerpiece of the night, a massive black grand piano. It gleamed under the lights, looking sleek and dangerous, like a wild predator waiting to pounce. It was a world away from the chipped keys and sticky pedals Maya practiced on at home. A man walked onto the stage. He was the virtuoso, the maestro everyone had come to see. He was dressed in a sharp black tuxedo with tails that flowed behind him as he walked. He moved with a precise, almost robotic gait, his back straight, his face expressionless. He didn't wave or smile at the audience. He simply walked to the center of the stage, gave a stiff, curt bow, and sat down on the bench. He adjusted his coat, ran his hands quickly over his hair, and hovered his fingers over the keys for a brief moment before bringing them down. The sound that filled the hall was sharp and clear. He was playing a complicated piece by a composer Maya knew well, though she had never heard it played like this. His fingers were a blur, moving with a speed that seemed impossible. The notes were precise, each one perfectly placed, perfectly timed. There were no mistakes. It was technically flawless, like a machine executing a program perfectly. The melody soared through the high arches of the ceiling, bouncing off the walls and filling every corner of the room. Maya listened intently, her heart beating in time with the music. She watched his hands, trying to decipher the secret to his speed. She admired the control he had, the way he made the difficult passages seem effortless. But as the piece went on, she found herself tilting her head to the side slightly. The music was perfect, yes, but it was beautiful, like a statue made of ice, but it didn't seem to have any warmth behind it. It lacked the struggle, the pain, or the joy that Maya felt when she played. It was impressive, certainly, but it didn't make her want to cry, and it didn't make her feel like her chest was going to burst with feeling. It was just sound. She glanced around at the audience. They were mesmerized. The old man next to her had his eyes closed, a look of pure ecstasy on his face. The woman with the diamonds was leaning forward, nodding slightly with every difficult run. Everyone seemed to be in awe of the perfection they were witnessing. Maya felt a strange mix of emotions. She wanted to be that good. She wanted to have that control. But she also wondered if perfection was the point. She remembered how she played. At home, sometimes hitting wrong keys when she got too excited, sometimes slowing down because a part made her sad, sometimes speeding up because she couldn't contain the energy. Her teacher at school always told her to be careful, to be precise, to be like the masters. But tonight, listening to the master play, Maya wasn't so sure. The piece came to an end with a loud, resonant chord that seemed to hang in the air forever. The pianist lifted his hands, his body still, waiting for the silence to stretch just long enough to be dramatic. Then the applause exploded. It was a wall of sound, clapping and cheering, whistling from the back rows. The pianist stood up, gave the same stiff bow, and walked off stage for a moment before coming back out for an encore. He played another piece, and then another. Each one was met with the same thunderous approval. Maya clapped along with everyone else, her small hands stinging slightly, respected the hard work it took to get that good. She knew the hours of practice, the sore fingers, the repetition. But as the evening progressed, she found her attention wandering slightly. Now she looked at the empty piano bench when the pianist walked off to bow. She imagined herself sitting there. She imagined the feeling of the ivory keys under her fingertips, the resistance of the pedals under her feet. In her mind, she wasn't playing the notes perfectly. In her mind, she was pouring her soul into the instrument, making the wooden box sing and cry and laugh. The hour grew late. The main part of the recital was winding down. The atmosphere in the hall was relaxed now, as the audience felt they had gotten their money's worth. The pianist returned to the stage for what was supposed to be the final time. He sat down, but instead of launching into another complex sonata, he paused. He tapped the microphone a few times, causing a screech of feedback that made everyone wince. He leaned in, his voice deep and accented, echoing through the room. "I have played for you tonight the music of the great masters," he said, his tone serious. "But music is not just about the past. It is not just about what is written on the page. It is about the spirit. And sometimes, the spirit is found in the most unexpected places." The audience murmured, confused. They looked at each other, wondering what was happening. This wasn't in the program. Maya leaned forward in her seat, her curiosity piqued. She sensed a shift in the energy of the room. The pianist stood up and walked to the edge of the stage, the bright spotlight leaving him in silhouette as he looked out into the darkened auditorium. "I see many people here tonight," he continued, his eyes scanning the rows of seats like a predator looking for prey. "Experts, critics, teachers, but I want to find someone who listens with their heart, not just their head." The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody moved. The air was electric with anticipation. Maya held her breath, a knot forming in her stomach. She had a sudden, inexplicable feeling, a tingling at the base of her neck. She watched the pianist's gaze sweep across the upper balconies, then move down to the floor level. It moved like a spotlight, passing over rows of people who shrank back in their seats, not wanting to be called upon. The gaze moved closer and closer to the front, until it stopped. It stopped right on her. The moment felt like it stretched on for an eternity, though it was likely only a few seconds. The pianist stood at the very edge of the stage, his hand raised, pointing a finger directly into the audience. The bright spotlight followed his gesture, cutting through the dim lighting of the hall like a laser. The beam of light moved over the heads of the people in the front rows, illuminating a woman in a large hat who shrank away in embarrassment. Then a man checking his phone, who looked up in confused panic. But the light didn't stop there. It kept going, sliding down the row until it landed squarely on Maya. She froze. Her heart, which had been beating fast before, now seemed to stop entirely. The intense white light blinded her for a moment, making it impossible to see anything beyond the small circle of illumination around her seat. She could feel the heat of the spotlight on her face. She knew that everyone in the entire hall was turning their heads to look at her. The murmuring that had ceased when the pianist spoke started up again, a low wave of whispers and rustling clothes. "You," the pianist said, his voice booming through the speakers. "The young lady in the blue dress. Please stand up." Maya's parents, sitting on either side of her, stiffened. Her father put a hand on her shoulder, perhaps to steady her, or perhaps to pull her back down, unsure if this was some kind of terrible mistake. Her mother gasped softly, clutching her handbag tight. Maya felt her face burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the spotlight. She wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She was just a girl from a normal neighborhood who liked to play old instruments. She wasn't a performer. She wasn't one of these people in the expensive clothes.
I don't think...
Maya stammered, her voice barely a squeak. She looked up at the stage, squinting against the glare. The pianist was smiling, but it wasn't a warm, friendly smile. It was the smile of a conductor who knew exactly what he was doing. He was enjoying the suspense. "Please," he insisted, gesturing with an open hand. "Don't be shy. I see you listening very intently all evening. You did not look at your phone once. You did not talk to your neighbor. You only listened. I want to know what you heard." There was a ripple of polite applause from the audience, encouraging her. People love a surprise, especially at a formal event where everything usually goes according to a strict plan. The pressure was immense. Maya felt her legs shaking as she slowly pushed herself up from the velvet seat. She felt incredibly small and exposed. The dress she had thought was pretty earlier now felt flimsy and plain. She smoothed the fabric nervously, wishing she had worn anything else. "What is your name?" the pianist asked. "Maya," she whispered into the microphone that an usher had quickly rushed over to her. "Maya," the pianist repeated, letting the name roll around his mouth. "A beautiful name. And do you play the piano, Maya?" The question hung in the air. This was the moment of truth. She could lie. She could say she only knew a little bit, or she could say no and hope he would pick someone else. But looking at the stage, at the massive black grand piano shining under the lights, she couldn't lie. Not in a place like this. Not to an artist like him, little, she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I have a keyboard at home." "Excellent," the pianist said, clapping his hands together once. The sound echoed sharply through the hall. "Then you must come up. I have a theory I want to test. A theory about music and youth." The audience erupted in cheers now. The stuffiness of the event vanished instantly, replaced by the thrill of the unknown. Maya looked at her parents. Her father looked worried, his brow furrowed, but her mother nodded slowly, a tear already glistening in her eye. She squeezed Maya's hand and whispered, "Go on. You can do it." Maya swallowed hard, her throat dry. She turned away from the safety of her seat and began the long walk down the aisle toward the stage. With every step, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes boring into her back. She heard the whispers, "Who is she? Is she a plant? Look at her. She's just a child." She tried to block them out, focusing on the rhythm of her own shoes on the carpeted floor. When she reached the stairs leading up to the platform, the steps seemed higher than usual. She climbed them slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. As she stepped onto the stage, the perspective shifted. She couldn't see the audience anymore because of the bright lights, which was a relief. In front of her, the piano loomed larger than life. Up close, it looked terrifying. It was a beast of polished wood and steel strings, gleaming and dangerous. The pianist walked over to meet her. Up close, he was tall and imposing, smelling of expensive cologne and stale coffee. He didn't offer his hand to shake. Instead, he gestured toward the bench. "Sit," he commanded, but not unkindly. Maya sat down. The bench was hard and smooth, different from the wobbly wooden stool she had at home. She adjusted her position, swinging her legs slightly. Her feet dangled above the pedals, hovering in the air. She felt ridiculous. She looked like a toddler playing pretend at a grown-up's desk. The pianist stood off to the side, crossing his arms. He looked at the audience, then back at her. "This piano," he announced to the crowd, "is one of the finest in the world. It responds to the slightest touch. It requires a master hand." He turned his gaze back to Maya. "But sometimes, the greatest master is not the one with the most practice, but the one with the purest heart." He leaned in close to Maya. "Play something," he whispered to her. "Anything. A scale. A nursery rhyme. A song you learned yesterday." Maya stared at the keys. They were white and black, stretching out into the darkness. Her fingers hovered over them, shaking. She felt a surge of panic. What could she play? She knew pieces by Beethoven and Mozart. But compared to what this man had played earlier, her version seemed like child's play. If she played a simple song, people would laugh. If she tried to play something hard and messed up, they would cringe. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She remembered the feeling she had earlier, the feeling that the pianist's performance was perfect but empty. She remembered the way she played at home when no one was watching, when she played just for the love of the sound. She closed her eyes for a brief second, shutting out the pianist, the audience, and the fear. She imagined she was back in her living room, with the rain hitting the window pane. Her right hand moved toward the keys. She hesitated. The silence in the hall was heavy, pressing against her eardrums. She could hear a pin drop. She could hear the pianist breathing beside her. She thought about standing up and running away, but her curiosity was stronger than her fear. She wanted to know what this piano felt like. She wanted to know if it sounded different. She placed her thumb on a C note. It was a simple note, low and deep. She pressed it down. The sound that came out was richer and fuller than anything she had ever heard. It resonated through the floorboards and vibrated in her chest. It was a beautiful sound, but it was just one note. The pianist didn't say anything. He waited. Maya took another breath. She decided not to play a nursery rhyme. She decided not to play a complicated sonata she was still learning. Instead, she began to play a melody she had heard in a movie once, a slow, sad melody that had stuck in her head for years. She didn't know the name of it, but she knew how it felt. It felt like saying goodbye. She started with 2 notes, a slow interval that hung in the air. Then, her left hand found a deep bass note to match it. The audience was silent. There was no coughing, no whispering. They were watching the small girl in the simple dress, wondering what on earth was about to happen. The pianist watched her hands. He saw the hesitation, the nervousness. But he also saw the way she curved her fingers, positioning them carefully. He saw the way she touched the keys, not as if they were enemies to be conquered, but as friends to be treated gently. He raised an eyebrow slightly. He had expected her to bang on the keys, frightened by the setting. He had expected a chaotic mess of noise. But this was careful. This was deliberate. Maya blocked everything out. She focused on the vibration of the strings. The piano was incredibly responsive. The slightest pressure produced a singing tone. She played the first phrase of the melody, her fingers moving slowly. The notes floated out into the hall, clear and pure. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't fast. It was just a simple, haunting tune. She waited for the laughter. She waited for someone to shout next, but it didn't come. The silence just got deeper. She played the next phrase, adding a bit more volume. Her foot searched for the damper pedal. She couldn't reach it comfortably. She had to stretch her leg all the way out and point her toe. It was awkward, but she managed to press it down. The sound opened up, swelling like the ocean. The pianist stepped a little closer, intrigued. He watched her posture. It wasn't technically correct by the standards of the conservatory. She was hunched over the keys, too close, her elbows tucked in. But there was an intensity in her body language that fascinated him. She wasn't thinking about the rules. She was thinking only about the music. The first few moments passed. Maya was still terrified, but the music was a lifeline. As long as she was playing, she didn't have to look at the crowd. She didn't have to think about the famous pianist watching her. She was just a girl and a piano, telling a story together. She reached the chorus of the song in her mind, and her hands began to move with a bit more confidence. The simple melody began to weave a spell, unexpected and unasked for, over the grand hall. The audience leaned forward, captivated by the sight of this small child summoning such a big sound from the giant instrument. The experiment had begun, and nobody knew where it would lead. The initial shock of the first few notes had faded, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence that filled the vast hall like water filling a bathtub. Maya sat hunched over the keys, her posture a disaster according to any strict music teacher, but her focus absolute. The simple, sad melody she had chosen was ringing in the air, clear as a bell. It was a tune most people didn't know. A forgotten piece from an old movie soundtrack she had heard late one night, but the emotion in it was universal. It spoke of loneliness and of hope, two things Maya understood deeply. She kept her eyes squeezed shut, blocking out the blinding spotlight and the hundreds of faces she couldn't see. In the darkness behind her eyelids, it was just her and the vibration of the strings. She could feel the sound traveling through the piano bench and into her bones. It was a sensation she had only ever felt on her old beat-up keyboard at home, but here, on this 9-foot concert grand, it was magnified 1,000 times. The notes seemed to hang in the air for a long time, singing with a richness that made her want to cry. The pianist, the great maestro who had commanded the stage just minutes ago, stood perfectly still, off to the side. He had expected the girl to freeze. He expected her to play a few clumsy notes, perhaps Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and then burst into tears from the pressure. He had brought her up as a prop, a way to show the gap between an amateur and a master. But as he listened, his arms uncrossed and fell to his sides. He tilted his head, listening not to the technique, but to the tone. There was a strange quality to her playing, a raw, unpolished honesty that was incredibly rare. Maya's hands moved slowly. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't trying to play as fast as her fingers could move. She was letting the song breathe. Because her feet barely reached the pedals, she had to stretch her right leg out all the way, her heel lifted off the floor to gently press down on the sustain pedal. It was an awkward, uncomfortable position, but she made it work. Every time she lifted her foot to dampen the sound, the transition was smooth. Natural, she reached the end of the first verse of the melody and hesitated. This was the moment where fear usually crept back in. What do I do next? She thought. Do I stop? Do I play it again? The silence was terrifying. It felt like the air was being sucked out of the room. She could hear her own breathing, loud and ragged in her ears. She waited for the coughing to start, for the shuffling of feet, the signs of boredom. But there was nothing. The audience was holding a collective breath. They were drawn in by the sight of this small, ordinary girl, creating something so beautiful in such a high-pressure environment. The pianist took a step closer to the piano. He looked at the girl's hands. They were small, the fingernails bitten down short, but they moved with a grace that couldn't be taught. He saw that she wasn't thinking about the mechanics of the music, which finger goes where, how hard to hit the key. She was playing by instinct. She was following the sound wherever it wanted to go. It was a kind of flow that professional musicians spent their entire lives trying to achieve, and rarely found for more than a few seconds at a time. Maya decided to continue. She didn't repeat the melody. Instead, she let her left hand find a lower register, deep and growling. She began to vary the rhythm. The song started to change, evolving from the simple movie tune into something more complex. Something that was coming directly from her imagination. She played a series of rolling chords in the bass, heavy and dark, like storm clouds gathering. Then her right hand answered with high, piercing notes that sounded like rain hitting the ground. The contrast was striking. The music was no longer just sad. It was dramatic. It told a story of a struggle. The audience leaned forward in their seats. The wealthy man in the tuxedo stopped checking his watch. The university students closed their notebooks. They stopped seeing a little girl playing a piano and started seeing a musician painting. A picture with sound. Maya's body began to sway slightly with the music. The tension in her shoulders started to melt away, replaced by a fierce concentration. She forgot about the maestro standing nearby. She forgot about the cameras she could sense pointed at the stage. She even forgot about her parents sitting in the front row. For the first time in her life, she was playing for herself. But on the biggest stage in the city, the volume of the music began to grow. She was hitting the keys harder now, putting her whole weight into the chords. The piano, which had been a gentle beast under her light touch, now roared. The sound was huge, filling every corner of the hall. It was a risky move. To play that loudly on such a sensitive instrument required control, and if she missed, the sound would be harsh and ugly. But she didn't miss. Her fingers found the right keys every time, driven by an emotion she didn't know she had inside her. She thought about the things she usually kept inside. She thought about the kids at school who didn't understand her. She thought about the worry in her parents' voices when they talked about bills. She thought about the feeling of being small in a big world. All those feelings poured out of her and into the keys. The music became angry, then pleading, then peaceful. The pianist watched, completely mesmerized. He realized now that this was not a joke. This was not a cute moment for the audience to say awe about. This was a genuine musical experience. He saw tears streaming down the face of the woman in the front row, the one with the diamond necklace. He saw the old man next to her with his hand over his heart. The atmosphere in the hall had completely shifted. The arrogance of the evening had been replaced by humility. Maya's fingers were starting to ache. She was playing harder and faster than she ever had before. Her right hand flew up the keyboard, playing a run of notes that shimmered like glass. It wasn't a perfect run by technical standards. Her thumb was a bit heavy. The tempo wavered slightly, but the emotional power of it carried it through. It sounded like a sudden gasp of joy. She transitioned back into the main melody, but it was different now. It was louder, stronger. It was no longer a whisper. It was a statement. She played the final phrase with a conviction that made her seem taller. As she approached the last few notes, the music began to slow down. She played a delicate high note that hung in the air like a star. And then, with her left hand, she played the final. Resolving chord, she lifted her hands off the keys. The last note vibrated through the wooden floor, up the legs of the bench, and into the air. It was a deep, resonant sound that seemed to last forever. Maya didn't move. She sat with her hands hovering over the keys, her chest heaving. She slowly opened her eyes. The spotlight was still blinding, but she could see the vague shape of the piano lid, reflecting the light back at her. She was afraid to move, afraid to break the spell. She didn't know if the silence meant they hated it or if they loved it. She just knew that she had given them everything she had. For 3 long seconds, nobody made a sound. It was the kind of silence that only happens when something profound has just occurred. The pianist stood still, staring at the girl, his usual mask of indifference completely gone. The audience sat frozen, many of them wiping tears from their eyes. Not sure if the performance was actually over, or if there was more to come. Maya sat there, her feet finally slipping off the pedal, the silence pressing against her ears like a heavy weight. She bit her lip, a sudden wave of insecurity crashing over her now that the music had stopped. Did I play too long? Did I make a mistake? She wanted to look at the maestro for approval, but she was terrified to turn her head. She felt small again, exposed in the bright light, with her hands resting in her lap, waiting for judgment to fall from the sky. The silence in the hall was heavy, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind that fills a room when something goes wrong. It was the kind of silence that happens when a shared experience is so powerful that words feel useless. The final chord Maya had played had faded into the air, but the feeling it left behind lingered like a ghost. The dust motes dancing in the spotlight seemed to hang suspended. Waiting for a signal that it was okay to move again, Maya sat frozen on the bench. Her hands were resting in her lap, trembling slightly. The adrenaline that had fueled her performance was starting to drain away. leaving her feeling empty and a little bit cold. She stared at the black and white keys, terrified to look up. In her mind, she was already replaying the performance, looking for the flaws. She knew she had missed a note in the middle section. She knew her timing had wavered when she got excited. She was sure the sophisticated audience was just being polite by not booing immediately. Then, a sound broke the spell. It wasn't a cough or a whisper. It was the sharp sound of a single person clapping. It echoed through the vast space, lonely and defiant. Maya flinched, her shoulders hunching up toward her ears. She didn't know where the sound was coming from, and she was too scared to look. Then came another clap, and then another. Within seconds, the sound grew. It wasn't a slow, polite ripple of applause like before. It was a sudden, explosive roar. The audience erupted. It started as a wave of noise from the back of the hall and swept forward like a tidal wave crashing onto the shore. People were on their feet instantly. The old man with the program was clapping so hard his hands were red. The woman in the diamonds had tears streaming down her face and was dabbing them with a handkerchief, not even trying to hide her emotion. Students in the balcony were whistling and shouting, something that was strictly forbidden in this usually stuffy venue. Maya's head snapped up. She blinked against the bright lights, trying to see through the glare. At first, she could only see shadows, a sea of dark outlines standing and moving. But as her eyes adjusted, she could see the faces. They weren't bored. They weren't critical. They were glowing. They were looking at her not as a curiosity or a joke, but with a kind of awe she had never seen directed at herself before. She sat there, stunned, her mouth slightly open. It felt like she was watching a movie of someone else. This couldn't be for her. She was just the girl who played the broken keyboard at home. But the noise was deafening. It washed over her, warm and overwhelming. She felt a blush rising from her neck to her cheeks, a mix of shyness and a strange, burning pride. The maestro, who had been standing like a statue off to the side, finally moved. He didn't walk back to the center of the stage to take a bow for himself, which is what everyone expected. Instead, he walked toward Maya. His expression was no longer cold or arrogant. The mask had slipped completely. He looked at her with a mix of shock and genuine respect, his eyebrows raised high. He stopped in front of the piano bench and looked out at the crowd, holding up his hands to quiet them. It took a long time for the hall to settle down. People didn't want to stop clapping. They wanted the moment to last. But eventually the shouting faded into a murmur and then into silence. The maestro leaned toward the microphone, but then he seemed to think better of it. He didn't need the microphone to be heard by the front rows. He didn't want the technology to get in the way of the moment. He turned to Maya and extended a hand. Not to shake it, but to help her stand. "Come," he said softly. His voice was gentle, lacking the harsh boom he had used earlier. Maya took his hand. It was warm and dry. She stood up, her legs feeling like jelly. The bench scraped loudly against the stage floor, a mundane sound that seemed incredibly loud in the quiet hall. She smoothed her dress again, a nervous habit she couldn't break. She felt incredibly short, standing next to the tall pianist. But for the first time that night, she didn't feel small. He didn't let go of her hand. He turned her toward the audience, keeping his hand on her shoulder like a proud father or a protective mentor. He bowed to the crowd, and then he nudged Maya gently. She bowed. It was a clumsy, quick bow, nothing like the elegant, practiced movements the maestro did. She nearly tipped over. She dipped so low. The audience laughed, but it wasn't a mean laugh. It was a laugh of affection. They loved her awkwardness. It made her real to them. She wasn't a polished statue. She was a living, breathing human being who had just poured her heart out. The maestro leaned back toward the microphone. "You see," he said, his voice echoing slightly. "I told you." The spirit. The crowd cheered again. He held up his hand to stop them after a moment. "That was not a performance of technique," he continued, looking out at the people. "It was a performance of soul. We spend years in conservatories learning how to make the perfect sound. We learn to control every muscle, every breath. But this young lady," he looked down at Maya, squeezing her shoulder, "she does not know the rules. so she cannot break them. She only plays what she feels. He turned back to Maya. That was a piece by Rachmaninoff, was it not? He asked, a teasing glint in his eye. Maya shook her head frantically, her eyes wide. No, sir, she squeaked. I don't know who wrote it. I just made it up. The maestro laughed, a genuine, surprised sound that crackled through the speakers. You made it up? He looked at the audience. Did you hear that? She played with the structure of a master composer, but she invented it in the moment. He looked at her with a new kind of seriousness. You have a gift, Maya. A rare one. You must not waste it. Maya didn't know what to say. Her throat was tight with unshed tears. She just nodded, biting her lip to keep it from trembling. The weight of his words settled on her shoulders, heavy but not unwelcome. For so long, she had felt invisible in her world, just another kid in a classroom. But here, under the lights, she felt seen. She felt like she mattered. The maestro stepped back and gestured to the piano. Play us one more, he said. Just something short. Maya looked at the piano. She was exhausted. Her fingers ached, and her heart felt like it had run a marathon. But looking at the keys, she felt that familiar pull again. The piano wasn't a monster anymore. It was a friend. She sat back down on the bench. The audience leaned in, hungry for more. This time, she didn't hesitate. She didn't close her eyes. She looked straight out into the darkness of the hall. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play a simple, lullaby-like melody. It was sweet and gentle, a stark contrast to the storm she had created earlier. It was a way of saying thank you. It was a way of saying goodbye. As she played, the lights in the hall began to come up slightly. It was a signal that the night was ending. The ushers stood by the doors, but nobody moved. Nobody wanted to leave. They watched the small girl play the simple song. Captivated by the piece, she radiated. When she finished the short piece, she stood up immediately. She didn't wait for applause this time. She looked at the maestro and gave a small curtsy. Then, guided by an usher who had come onto the stage, she walked toward the side stairs. As she stepped off the stage and into the wings, the sound of the applause changed. It became a wall of sound, chasing after her. Backstage, it was dim and cool. The air smelled of dust and old wood. Her parents were there waiting for her, their faces pale and shocked. Her father pulled her into a hug, lifting her off the ground. You did it, he whispered, his voice cracking. You really did it. Her mother was crying openly, smoothing Maya's hair back from her face. We are so proud of you, she said over and over again. Maya buried her face in her father's shoulder, finally letting the tears fall. She could still hear the roaring of the crowd from the other side of the curtain. She could still feel the vibration of the piano keys under her fingertips. But mostly, she felt a change deep inside. The girl who had walked into the hall that night was gone. She wasn't just a dreamer anymore. She was someone who could make 1,000 people feel something. She was a musician, and as she stood in the shadows of the wings, listening to the world cheer for her, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The applause from inside the hall was still vibrating in the air, a distant roar like the ocean heard from inside a shell. But backstage, everything was quiet and dimly lit. The smell of dust and old velvet was strong here, a sharp contrast to the perfumes and polished wood of the auditorium. Maya stood with her parents in a small corridor near the side exit. Her father's arm was draped protectively around her shoulders, and her mother was wiping tears from her cheeks with a crumpled tissue. They were huddled close, a tight knot of family in the middle of a strange new world. Maya felt like she was floating. Her feet didn't seem to touch the ground properly. Her hands, which had flown across the piano keys just minutes ago, were now resting calmly at her sides. The adrenaline that had pumped through her veins was starting to fade, leaving behind a warm, glowing tiredness. She looked up at her parents. Their faces were a mix of shock and overwhelming pride. They had always encouraged her playing, buying her secondhand music books and listening to her practice after school. But they had never seen anything like what had just happened. They hadn't just seen a little girl playing a song. They had seen their daughter transform into someone else entirely. We should go, her father said softly, breaking the silence. He looked a bit dazed. Let's give the stage back to the professionals. They started to walk toward the heavy metal door that led out to the street. The hallway was lined with posters of past performers, famous men and women in tuxedos and gowns, looking serious and accomplished. For years, Maya had walked past this door, peering through the small glass window, wondering what it felt like to be on the other side. Tonight, she was the one leaving through the artist's exit. It felt surreal. Before they could push the door open, a deep voice echoed down the corridor. Wait. Please, wait. She knew that voice. It was the voice that had boomed across the stage earlier, the voice that had invited her up from the audience. She turned around slowly. The maestro was walking toward them. He had taken off his tuxedo jacket and was carrying it draped over one arm. His tie was loosened, and he looked tired, but his eyes were bright. He moved faster than Maya expected, his long strides eating up the distance between them. Behind him, a man in a headset with a clipboard followed closely, looking flustered. You cannot leave yet, the pianist said when he reached them. He was slightly out of breath. He stopped in front of Maya and looked down at her. Up close, he looked different. He wasn't the distant, arrogant master from the stage. He looked human. He looked like a man who had just witnessed something he didn't understand and wanted to know more. Her father stepped forward instinctively, putting himself slightly between Maya and the stranger. Sir, he asked politely but guardedly. The pianist smiled, a genuine warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Please, do not worry. I am not going to steal her away, he said, his tone light. He looked at Maya. I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you. Maya squeaked. I should be thanking you. I played your piano. Pianist laughed, a short, happy sound. My piano is just wood and wire. It takes a human to make it sing. What you did tonight. It was important. Not just for them, out there, he gestured back, toward the hall. For me, I have been playing for 40 years. Sometimes I forget why I started. I play the notes perfectly, but I forget the feeling. Tonight, you reminded me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small white card. It was simple, with just a name and a phone number printed in black ink. He held it out to Maya. You have a gift, he said seriously. A raw, natural gift. If you ever want to learn how to control that power, if you ever want to see how far you can go, you call this number. Do not waste what you have on silence. Maya looked at the card, then up at her parents. Her mother gasped softly. She knew who this man was. She knew that a card from him was worth more than anything money could buy. It was a key to a door they didn't even know existed. Go on, her father urged, nudging her gently. Maya took the card. It was stiff and smooth between her fingers. She held it like it was made of gold. Thank you, she whispered. I will. The pianist nodded. He put his hand on top of her head for a brief second, a gesture of blessing, and then turned back toward the stage. The man with the clipboard scrambled to keep up. The pianist walked away, his footsteps echoing on the concrete floor, leaving the family standing in the soft yellow light of the corridor. Maya looked down at the card in her hand. It was real. Her name wasn't on it, but it felt like it belonged to her. She slipped it carefully into the pocket of her dress, right next to her heart. Ready? Her father asked, opening the heavy metal door. A blast of cool night air rushed in, smelling of rain and exhaust fumes. It was the smell of the real world, the world outside the magic of the concert hall. Maya stepped through the door and out, onto the sidewalk. The street was wet from a light shower that had passed while they were inside. The street lamps reflected off the puddles on the ground, making the city look like a painting. There were a few people walking by, heads down, on their way home from work or dinner. They had no idea what had just happened inside the grand concert hall. They had no idea that the universe had shifted slightly for a 12-year-old girl in a blue. Maya took a deep breath. The air was cold, but it felt good. It cleared her head. She looked back at the massive stone building behind her. It loomed tall and imposing against the night sky, silent now. The lights were turning off in the windows, one by one. The show was over. She got into the back seat of the family car. It was a familiar routine, the smell of the upholstery, the sound of the engine starting, the way her father adjusted the rearview mirror, but nothing felt familiar. Everything looked different. The streetlights seemed brighter. The colors of the passing cars seemed more vivid as they drove away from the city center. Heading toward their quiet neighborhood, Maya didn't say much. Her parents talked in low voices in the front seat, discussing the night, wondering what it meant for the future. Maya leaned her head against the cold window and watched the world go by. She thought about the maestro's words. "You must not waste it." She looked at her hands in the darkness of the car. They were small hands with calloused fingertips from practicing on cheap keys. But tonight, they had touched thousands of people. She realized that her life wasn't going to be the same after tonight. She wasn't just going to be the quiet girl who sat in the back of the class. She had a voice now, a loud, beautiful voice that came from her heart and through her fingers. The car turned onto their street. It was a modest street with small houses and overgrown gardens. It was home. Maya had always loved it, but tonight she saw it differently. She saw that it wasn't a cage. It was just a starting point. When the car stopped, she got out and walked to the front door. She could hear the old out-of-tune piano in the living room. She had never loved that piano more than she did right now. It wasn't a concert grand, and it didn't have a spotlight, but it was where everything began. She walked into the house and sat down on the bench. It was familiar and comfortable. She placed her hands on the keys. They didn't shine under the lights. They were yellowed with age. But when she pressed down, the sound that came out was hers. She didn't play a masterpiece. She didn't play a song by a famous composer. She just played a melody. A simple, happy melody. She played it softly, so as not to wake the neighbors. But she played it with a new confidence. The fear was gone. The feeling of not belonging was gone. She knew now that she didn't need to be the maestro. She didn't need to wear a tuxedo or sit in a palace to be a musician. She just needed to be true to the music inside her. Maya smiled to herself in the dark room. The audience was gone. The applause was over. The card was in her pocket, waiting for tomorrow. But tonight, she was just a girl and her piano, and that was enough. The future was a vast, unwritten sheet of music, and for the first time, she couldn't wait to play it.